Okay, well, welcome everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started tonight. We've got about an hour for our training, and then I blocked off about half an hour to an hour afterwards if you want to stay for any other questions that you have that aren't covered in today's training. You're welcome to stay after. So we are all here today because we care about the well-being of children. Ideally, you're here to learn some more about mental health. Maybe you're thinking about your specific child in your life. Maybe you work with children and youth. And so you're hoping to probably leave today with some more information or skills. Just briefly, this is not an in-depth presentation. Mental health is a very complicated topic that I honestly could do a full day training on. So I'm going to primarily hit the high points. But like I said before I started the recording, if you have any questions at all that are more specific than what we cover, you're welcome to add them in the chat or stay after for our Q&A. So I like to start off with this quote by Abraham Maslow. It says, in any given moment, we have two options: to step forward into growth or to step back into safety. Abraham Maslow, he's most well known if you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's basically the theory that someone needs their basic needs filled first, that someone needs food, water, shelter, safety, rest before they can begin fulfilling other needs. What I think this quote is saying is basically that for our mental health to thrive, we can't just maintain the status quo. It's something that we have to be proactively working on, even in the moments where we're like, I'm good, I'm feeling okay. I think another thing this quote is saying is that growth can be hard, and that sometimes it's easier to stay in what we feel safe in, even if we know it's not what ultimately is best for us. So even though growth is hard, it be absolutely worth pursuing. And we are all here because we are working or have children in our life we care about. So we want to encourage them to not only have that safety and stability, but we want to promote that growth. And we'll spend some time talking about how we can promote that growth by leading by example, and some things that we can challenge our youth in our life with to encourage their ultimate well-being. So this is just a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about today. I'll briefly talk on some general mental health information, some stats, how to protect our kiddos from some of the things that can influence their life and increase their risk of mental health conditions. But I want to spend most of my time talking about how to recognize if our child is struggling, and then how to intervene. Not only what we can do to protect our children, but accessing external resources. So I'm going to be spending most of my time today talking about when our mental health is bad, and how to identify poor mental health. But I always think it's important to start with the basic premise that mental health is so much more than when someone is struggling. It's something we all have, we work on every single day. Like if you've had a stressful day, you go home to take a bubble bath, or you go on a walk with your dog because those things make you feel better. That is mental health. When you lose someone that's close to you and you grieve their loss, that's mental health. And even when everything is going well, we're having a great time, that's mental health too. People sometimes don't like to talk about mental health because we associate it just with those poor mental health. But we really need to start to shift the conversation and talk about mental health all the time, because when you talk about it all the time, it can break down some of those barriers to people having conversations about just mental health in general. Whether or not someone is mentally healthy depends a lot on how they're feeling about their own mental health and well-being. Mental health is a very individual experience. For example, two people can experience the exact same thing and come out having completely different experiences and internalizing some things. And some people, some people hold on to that traumatic experience, and others might be completely fine. So, and just think about in your own life, how many times you have really been struggling though and told someone that you're fine, because it's almost easier to say you're fine than even start to think about what you're feeling or having to talk about it. And sometimes you say you're fine because this is just a bad day. Things are going to get better tomorrow. I just need to move on past it. But when someone comes to you and says, I am struggling with my mental health, especially with our young children, and this is something I hear from parents a lot, is I don't understand what my kid has to be so stressed about. Life gets so much harder later. They have their food taken care of. They don't have to worry about paying bills. They don't have to work. What do they have to be stressed about? And they use that logic to dismiss their child's struggles. When you're struggling with your mental health, it's so hard to have those conversations and to sort of put it out there that I am struggling. And just struggling with your mental health is hard enough. No one that is struggling with their mental health should have to justify the way they're feeling or prove that they're struggling. So if someone comes to you, whether that be your child or an adult in your life, and says to you, I am struggling with my mental health, you need to respect those feelings and take what they're saying at their word, even if in that moment you don't understand why. Because the reality is, sometimes there is no why as to why you're struggling with your mental health, which is something that we will get into. So one of my favorite definitions of mental health comes from the World Health Organization. It says that someone is quote unquote mentally healthy when they achieve a state of well-being where they are able to realize their own abilities, can cope with the stressors of life, can work productively, and are able to make contributions to their community. And this definition is something we should always be working toward for ourselves and for the children in our life. What I love most about this definition is that nowhere in it does it say free from illness. And so my favorite thing about that is because it's just a reminder that someone can have a mental health condition like depression or anxiety and be mentally healthy. And there are a number of things that can impact our mental health, from our genetic code to the environment we're raised in, the current environment, whether good or bad. That can include the physical structures around us, the actual environment, including environmental pollutants, the political environment, the emotional environment. All of these factors work together to contribute to someone's mental health, whether that be something that affects us in a positive way or in a negative way. But at some point, we will all struggle with our mental health. Half of people in their lifetime have a mental health condition diagnosis. And those are things like I've said, depression, anxiety. But that 50% number doesn't include everyone that will struggle with their mental health. And that's all of us. I think, if anything, the last couple of years have taught us that it is maybe not a welcome part of life, but we will all struggle, and we have ebbs and flows with our mental health. We're all going to experience problems in our life that challenge our ability to be happy and confident. How we address and cope with those problems, that's what shows the strength of our mental health. And our mental health isn't an on and off switch. It's more like a thermometer, where there are different degrees of health and mental health. So this is kind of like a broad overview of how those emotions and mental health can kind of come into play. So especially in our young kids, which this is something you can communicate to them, they might view it as a failing or a fault to be angry or sad. But negative emotions in themselves, they're not a sign of a mental health issue. They're not a bad thing. They're normal and healthy parts of life. When they get in trouble at school, it's normal and healthy for them to be a little angry. Or if they miss out on an opportunity, like I was supposed to go to space camp when I was in elementary school, and I got in trouble and I got grounded, so I didn't get to go. Normal to be sad. Yes, it was a consequence of my action, but it's healthy for me to have a reaction to that. It would almost be less healthy for me to not have any reaction. But especially when these emotions are in reaction to specific circumstances, if they are temporary, like there's nothing wrong with those. But when we start experiencing things that are more intrusive, like stress or grief, those can be a little bit more difficult to deal with. That might require some additional stress management skills or some different habits that we can form to deal with those. But those first two levels are kind of the levels we want to stick in. That last level is where we get to the point where someone might be having disordered thoughts, emotions, or behaviors. And typically this is when someone could potentially meet the criteria for a mental health condition. And it is worth noting that even someone with a mental health condition, they can go up and down along this spectrum. Me as a person with an anxiety disorder, I also experience stress. I also experience healthy expression of emotions. I'm not in a constant state of experiencing emotions in a distressing way. And like I said, mental health conditions are very common. Half of us could be diagnosed with one in our lifetime. 1 in 5 could be diagnosed with one every year. And 1 in 20 meet the criteria of what's known as a serious mental illness, or also known as SMIs, or for kids, sometimes they're referred to as SEDs, or serious emotional disturbances. There are certain mental health conditions that fall within this category, but typically they're going to be ones that cause the most difficulty in someone's life in being able to achieve that definition of mental health and being able to participate in the community, being able to achieve someone's goals, or even sometimes being able to handle activities of daily living. And just because those are serious doesn't mean they're not treatable, doesn't mean we need to be more scared of those SMIs or SEDs, but they can be harder to treat and sometimes are more of a lifelong thing versus depression that may be episodic, where you kind of address it. It's something you deal with for a few years, and then it's not something you deal with ever again. And the reason that we talk about it with our young people is that mental health conditions start to emerge in adolescence. 75% of mental health conditions, someone will have experienced their first symptom of that mental health condition by the age of 24. 50% of anyone who will have a mental health condition in their lifetime will experience their first symptom by the time they're 14. And almost half of everyone who will have a mental illness in their life can have more than one diagnosis in their lifetime. So it's not uncommon for things like depression and anxiety to coexist, or especially like looking at eating disorders and anxiety and depression, substance use disorders and anxiety and depression. It's not uncommon for those to coexist. And different mental health conditions or mental illnesses have become more common the older someone gets. And so on the left side of the screen here, you see the percent of youth that are diagnosed with that condition. And on the right is the average age that they're diagnosed. So anxiety is the most common mental health condition for our young people. The average age that get diagnosed is 6. Behavior disorders, those are things like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and conduct disorder. Especially things like ODD and conduct disorder are historically more difficult to treat. They might require more intervention from different types of therapists. Then we have depression. The average age is 13, about 1 in 5 or so every year. Sorry, that's their total percentage. And then substance use disorder, the average age of onset for that is 15, which makes sense. The older our young people get, the more access generally they have to substances. One of the cool tools that we have in Tennessee and really across the nation, and something you might have seen make the news recently, is called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, or I'm going to amend it to YRBS. So the YRBS, essentially what it does is it's an anonymous survey to middle and high school students. They're primarily doing high school now. And this is the stat from Tennessee. So of those youth surveyed anonymously, they self-report their information. About a third have felt sad or hopeless in the last year, which means they meet the criteria for depression. About 1 in 5 seriously considered attempting suicide, which it's not uncommon for young people to have the occasional suicidal thought. It is something to take seriously, but it's not something to make them feel ashamed about. It is something we want to take seriously. When it starts to be more concerning is when they start thinking about how they would do it. If they make a plan on how they would attempt suicide. One of my favorite, I just attended a training earlier this week, and one of my favorite ways I learned you can ask that question is, instead of asking, have you thought about how you would do it, or have you made a plan? You can ask them if they've done any like Google searches about suicide, or if they've searched on social media, because that kind of gets them more into a place where they're actively thinking about it. About 1 in 10 of those students surveyed attempted suicide, and 4% of those surveyed attempted suicide that required intervention. And in 2019, which was the last year the YRBS was done, there were 55 youth suicides, and that's 10 to 19 in the state of Tennessee. So you can see comparatively, and I find it's any person lost to suicide is, especially young people, it is a huge loss, and it ripples through the community and through the family. I think because we always think of all the potential, but I see almost some hope when I look at these statistics, and that yes, our young people are struggling and we absolutely need to do something about it. But most of our young people aren't dying by suicide. There's a caveat with that stat, and that not a lot of young people die in general. If you look at the most common causes of death for our young people, the top number one cause of death is accidents. And number 2, right after that, is suicide. So not a lot of our young people are dying, but they are more likely to die by suicide than things like cancer. So there's still some work that we need to do. And something that made the news recently, but I didn't include in this slide, they just released a new nationwide report. And these numbers for the nation are very concerning, and there are some gender disparities. 57% of female students surveyed reported feeling sad or hopeless in the last year, and male numbers are up significantly as well. So from what we've seen over the last couple of years, it may not be a surprise to us that our youth are struggling more with their mental health. And so there are things that can contribute or decrease to someone's risk of having a mental health condition. And it's important for us to take a look at ourselves to see what type of caregiver we are, because mental illnesses, they are caused by a combination of genetics and our environment. We can't do anything about genetics. But when we look at environmental risk, we really need to be hypercritical of the type of caregiver that we are. So looking at our own history of mental health problems, the trauma that we've experienced, and how those could be affecting our children in negative ways. No one wants to admit their own faults and shortcomings, but when we face them head on, we at least have a good foundation of knowledge to know the issues our child may be facing. because no one wants to be like the dog in this meme where, growth is hard and sometimes it's easier to pretend like nothing is wrong because we're used to the feeling, even though the situation may suck. We're like, okay, it's better than maybe challenging myself. But if we acknowledge those traumas in our life, the goal is to grow a little bit from what we've experienced and not keep telling ourselves we're fine, and use our own history and help our children grow productively from that. So there are a lot of reasons for prevention. We do want to look at our own genetic risk. So I am expecting a couple bundles of joy this year, and I'm looking at my own genetic risk factor. I've got a history of anxiety and depression. My therapist told me there may be some OCD in there. So I know my kiddos are going to be more likely to have a mental health condition themselves. So I know what to be on the lookout for, and I know what I need to do when that happens. But you also need to look at those environmental factors, including any traumas that you've experienced or traumas that your kids have experienced. So the more of these that we have, the more likely they are to have a mental health issue. So that includes things like abuse, neglect, other types of household dysfunction like domestic violence, if a relative has been incarcerated, substance use in the home. And trauma can also include things that happen outside of the home, such as natural disasters. So our young folks that in Sevierville that lived through all the fires that passed through a few years ago, and then they're always getting fires now. It seems like once a year we get a really bad scare. That can increase someone's chance of a mental health condition, or community violence. Because when we experience a trauma, and everyone's brain processes trauma differently, basically it triggers a stress response, and we get these chemicals in our brain that they're a good thing in the moment. They give us more energy, they make us alert, they put us in that fight or flight state. But when the more of these situations that someone experiences, the more likely it is for those hormones to stick around. And most of the time, when we feel those ways, we kind of react instinctive ways, which is to go to quick fix solutions, which are things that make us feel good in the moment. So these can lead a child, especially, to create unhealthy, disruptive, or addictive behaviors as a way of coping. And because childhood is such a critical time for brain development, these patterns get set in stone. The earlier these patterns start, so you want to try to step in with healthier ways of coping, because when we've got those unhealthy patterns, it just creates a very rocky foundation for later life. And unfortunately, it can be kind of disheartening. I am a big fan of meeting people where they're at and recognizing, let's say you're on this call today and there's been domestic violence in your home, and you're doing your best to parent and take care of your kid, but maybe you can't leave because you can't afford to leave. You'd be homeless, XYZ. We always need to keep working to create as healthy of a situation as we can for our children with the resources that we have. But I don't expect any parent to be perfect. It's more important to be self-aware and just try to move even gradually to a healthier and more safe space. And it can be harder for us to move to that space because of our own history and the things that we bring to the picture as parents. We can't just forget that our trauma and our experience that led us to become who we are, those just aren't there, and we're going to be the best parent in the whole world and be perfect 100% of the time. We are trying to become more aware and be better caregivers with the tools that we've got. But there are things that can protect our child from some of the negative side effects of traumatic situations in life. And these are factors for resilience. trauma, if we look at a child's mental health like a foundation of a house, things like a genetic predisposition and trauma put cracks in the foundation. Building these resilience factors is like adding supports, extra supports to the foundation. The cracks are still there, right? But the fact that we've added these supports means, let's say we get all that nice flooding here in East Tennessee. So let's say some heavy torrential rain comes down. We add those supports, our foundation is less likely to come crumbling down. And so that's what we want to be aware of, the risk factors, do what we can to mitigate that risk. But ultimately, really what we want to do is build these protective factors. And so these are some signs that a child is resilient. And these are things that you can teach them through example, build with them. Things like having close and healthy relationships, and those can be family relationships. Having a positive view of themselves. If they're able to manage strong feelings and impulses, so that is coping skills and stress management, which we'll talk about. Things like problem solving skills, being able to think of an alternative solution when the first solution doesn't work instead of just giving up. Having good communication skills, that's one of those things that kids learn by example. And if they're able to find that positive meaning in life despite traumatic circumstances. I do want to say one caveat with this resilience. Resilience is kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but if we look back at my analogy of using the foundation, let's say we've added these extra supports to our foundation to support the child's mental health. But let's say the house was built on rocky soil. It doesn't matter, like those houses that are built on the sides of hills in California, and they deal with those mudslides. It doesn't matter sort of what we do, that risk is always going to be there. So in life, let's say we have a child that's growing up in an area where there aren't a lot of resources. Things like libraries, parks, access to healthy food, or accessible and affordable healthcare. When someone lives in an environment like that, and then you add in genetic risk or trauma, even when you're adding these supports of resilience, it's harder for those supports to work because you're in a situation where you just end up being hopeless and feel helpless. And hopelessness and helplessness are some of the biggest barriers for someone to be mentally well. So how can we recognize if our child is struggling with their mental health? I'm not going to read through all of these, and you will get a copy of these slides. So if you're sitting here taking notes, don't worry about writing everything down. So mental health issues, mental health conditions, mental illnesses, they are not temporary things. They are not a bad day. They are persistent, new symptoms that last and exhibit almost every day for 2 weeks or more. To be officially diagnosed with certain mental health conditions, the symptoms have to be sometimes present for longer. Like I think for my anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, the symptoms have to be present for, I believe, 6+ months to be officially diagnosed. But the tipping point I usually tell parents is 2 or more weeks. Especially if something hasn't happened recently in life. But let's say they are going through a breakup. Let's say we had someone in our family die or a pet die. Reactions to grief are not in loss does not mean someone has a mental illness. But let's say a month from that incident and the severity level is exactly the same, that's when we might start having conversations of, okay, maybe this is something deeper. Maybe we need to take that next step. So there are a few things I'm going to point out on this list and talk about a little bit more. So we do want to be on the lookout for physical warning signs. Some of these may be easier for you to notice. And one note before I move into here, if someone just has one of these, it doesn't mean they have a mental illness. You're really looking for a couple different things. So if, let's say, we have a teenage boy and he starts eating more, that could be pretty par for the course, especially if nothing else is going on. But changes in eating habits can include eating too much or too little. You also want to pay attention to specifically what someone eats. If someone increasingly is focusing on being healthy, just because someone is at face value getting healthy doesn't mean the reasons behind it are. And the same thing behind any weight gain or loss, that's something you want to pay attention to. Sleep disturbances can include sleeping too much or too little, not being able to fall asleep, stay asleep, new or persistent nightmares. They may even seem fatigued or tired, even if they're getting a full 8 hours of sleep. Vague aches or pains, things like headaches, migraines, stomach pain. You see it especially in younger kids. They might say my stomach hurts, and what they really mean is I'm anxious. And the last physical sign is, like I said, weight gain or loss. Sometimes it's because of the literal changes in eating habits. Other times it's because of the different hormones that are in flux in our brain actually change our metabolism. So if we even haven't had any change in eating habits, it can cause us to either put on or lose weight. So like folks with anxiety, for example, sometimes their adrenaline is so off the charts, it ups their metabolism. And even if they eat and eat and eat, they aren't able to keep on any weight. And the same thing on the other side of the coin with anxiety, it can make cortisol stick around in your brain, which can cause you to hold on to weight, even if you aren't eating more. There are some emotional or behavioral warning signs you can also look out for. If your child becomes more aggressive, stubborn, hostile, or prone to outbursts, a shift up or down in grades can be a change, can indicate a change in someone's mental health. And you may think, oh, my kid's usually a C student and now they're making all straight A's. That's nothing to be concerned about. That's a great thing. But if, let's say, that change has come about because they're studying all the time and judge their self-worth based on their grades, they're really hard on themselves, they're not getting enough sleep, they're neglecting other things just so they can get that A, that could be a sign something's going on. If they lose interest in things they used to enjoy, or they don't get enjoyment out of things like they used to, even if they keep doing it, if they start avoiding certain places or people, or just people in general, if they regress to behaviors seen like in younger ages, so maybe they start wetting the bed or sucking their thumb. Changes in physical appearance are also something to be on the lookout for. I'm not talking about changes in fashion. I'm talking about if they stop showering or stop brushing their hair or covering certain parts of their body, which can indicate self-harm. New or more intense use of a substance to cope, even things that are legal and prescribed. I am seeing more and more of our young people these days using caffeine. They've got to go stop at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts on their way to school. That's something to pay attention to. If they start becoming more restless. And lastly, I want to touch on self-harm. Self-harm, contrary to popular belief, doesn't just happen on the wrist and the arms. Our young people know self-harm is bad. It is not something I should be doing. Most young people who are self-harming, that's what they know. And so how can they hide those behaviors? By harming in places that are easier to hide and not notice they are hidden. So places like shoulders, stomachs, thighs, also feet, sometimes like the bottom of feet. And so you may not be able to physically see But if you notice your child increasingly spending more time alone, or notice like if certain things go missing in your home, like lighters, razors, it could mean they're self-harming. And lastly, if they start talking about death or dying, making suicide threats, you need to intervene as soon as possible. It's one of those do not pass go, do not collect $200. You don't even ask yourself any other questions. You just get help as soon as you can. So the big question is it growing pains? Is it just a side effect of being a normal teenager, or is it a mental illness? There are 3 factors you can pay attention to that will tell you whether or not it's more likely to be teenage growing pains or mental illness. First thing to look at is intensity. Are the symptoms so intense your child doesn't want to get out of bed? Are they engaging in self-harm or having suicidal thoughts? If anything that you see from that list is persistent, chronic, or intense, more than likely it's a mental illness. And then you want to look at duration. Like I said, moodiness can come and go. In a typical teenager, they'll have more good days than bad days. But if the moodiness tends to be more chronic, lasts for a longer period of time without breaks, could be a mental illness. And lastly, domains. This is going to require some communication. Let's say you notice something going on at home. Then's the time to have a conversation, maybe with one of your kids' teachers, or see how their relationship with their friends are going. Mental illnesses don't just affect someone at school. They don't just affect someone at home. They affect someone across every sector of their life. And it can be affecting them in different ways to different extents, but it's going to affect them in every part of their life. So if we are noticing any of these signs, we really need to intervene. Early intervention works better, it's more effective, and it's easier to work with a young person when they're still young and their brain is still developing, versus even when you get into your 20s, it may be more difficult to intervene. And for me, effective intervention is multifaceted. Ultimately, mental health issues arise from someone's internal thoughts, and you see those expressed with their behaviors. But those behaviors and thoughts don't exist within a bubble. They're affected by someone's family and home life. They're affected by friends. They're affected by what happens at school and in their bigger environment, in their community. So you want to work inward. You want to work in, out, and out, in, to create the best possible environment for wellness to thrive. So the best thing that you can do to set your child up for success is by actively working ahead of time before they are struggling at all, by just creating an environment in your home, in your school, whatever reason you're here, is where conversations about mental health are normalized. And part of this normalization, an important part of this, is leading by example, is showing your kids with your words, and more importantly, actions, that mental health is nothing to be afraid of. So this means sharing your emotions and challenges, sharing that it's normal and healthy to be sad, to be angry. If you struggle with your mental health, especially if you're on this call and you're a parent, don't be afraid to disclose your own struggles with mental health. It is a fine line. You don't want your child to feel like they're having to caregive about you. But let's say you take medication for your mental health. Be like, yeah, mommy takes this pill every day because sometimes she feels sad. And that sadness doesn't go away. And that's a simplification. But you don't want them to feel like they're having to take care of you. But children are perceptive. And if something's going on, they probably notice it. And being silent on the matter sends a stronger message of talking about it is wrong. You want to ask questions when nothing is wrong. Use open-ended but specific questions. Instead of asking a question like, how was your day? Ask what was your favorite part of today? Or what was something you learned today? What was something that was difficult for you today? You also want to show care and attention to what they're telling you. One of the favorite things I've ever heard, shout out to Emily Hager at the Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network, is she said, if you don't care about the small things, your child won't think you're going to care about the big things. So make sure you care about the small things so they know that you will care and be them for the big things too. It's also important to help your child set healthy boundaries for themselves. So let them know it's okay to say no if they're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. And boundaries also mean providing them privacy within your home. So making sure they have their own space, even if they share a room, make sure they have their own time and private time to decompress and just be with themselves. There are also some other things to set yourself up for success, your whole family. Things like making sleep a priority, eating as healthy as you can, exercising from time to time. That'll improve everyone's well-being. And creating consistent routines can be really helpful for folks struggling with their mental health. You also want to remind your child that they're valued and they're loved. So giving them compliments, especially for things maybe folks won't typically compliment them on. And planning intentional time together is important because without screens, without distractions, because this can help give you a baseline of behavior and help you notice if something has shifted. If your child is struggling with their mental health, don't make the assumption that they're going to come to you and say, hey, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, I am struggling with my mental health. When you have a mental illness, your brain is literally functioning in a different way. So your thoughts can be telling you things that aren't true and making you feel certain kinds of ways that aren't really aligned with reality. So even if historically your child has been really open with you, they may have this thought in their head that there's nothing they can do. What's the point of talking about it? Or people are going to judge me. Or they think, oh, if I just try harder, things will get better. And this can all lead people to mask or pretend like everything is fine, like we talked about earlier. So sometimes you have to reach out and start that conversation. It's a good step in just starting that conversation to let your child know, I'm not ignoring you. I notice and respect and can tell that something is going on. And the words you choose are important. We'll talk about the right way to approach it, but it's almost more important to approach it with the right mindset. Always approach it with care and compassion. Be non-judgmental and realize that even though you're your child's age once, you don't know what their experiences have been. That's something I've had to remind myself is my children are going to be independent people. They're not always a reflection of me. I can give them the tools, but ultimately they get to choose what they do with those tools. You don't want to make any assumptions about what their diagnosis is. Don't label the process. And you want to be hopeful. When I say be hopeful, I don't mean telling them things will get better, because that's the last thing you want to hear when you're struggling with your mental health. What I mean is you continue to be hopeful so that when they have given up, you keep pushing forward and you keep trying. A good conversation starter is to just approach your child and tell them what you've noticed in terms of concrete behaviors, and leave the question open as to what's going on. They may not be ready to talk to you, and that's okay. You don't want to make sure you're not multitasking. Don't do what I do and have your phone in the hand, constantly checking notifications. Pay attention to how they're reacting to the conversation, if they're keeping eye contact, if their body is tensing up. And like I said, don't label the process. It's okay. The conversation is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable for you. It's going to be uncomfortable for your kid. All the most important things in life are uncomfortable to talk about. And the conversation your kids are going to have with their friends about mental health is going to be much different than the conversations they're going to have with you. So when you start these conversations, don't expect an immediate connection, but keep being persistent and don't give up. And it's okay if your child doesn't want to talk to you. They say, I don't want to, Mom, I'm sorry that I don't want to talk to you about this. That opens the door for you to say, would you be willing to talk to someone else about it? And so that can open the door to set your child up to talking to a counselor or a therapist. There are specific things you want to avoid, like punishing or patronizing language, putting the blame on them and saying things like, oh, what did you do? You're so smart. How did you let this happen? Or almost being dismissive, like, oh, I totally get what you're going through. I was depressed. Because we want to respect what they're going through and not make it all about us. We also don't want to sing things like calm down or you're being dramatic, you're doing it for attention. All of these can add fuel to the fire. We don't want to put in their brain something is wrong with me because they're already thinking that. We don't want to reinforce the message. Our goal is to create a safe and open environment for our child to talk to us and just be genuine in your love and care for the child and recognize they are an individual and you're kind of figuring things out together. When do you get help from a professional? I would never expect anyone on this call to quote unquote fix their child. Not that folks with mental illnesses need to be fixed. But make sure you are using a toolbox of resources, from resources within the school, making changes in your home, and outside resources can be helpful. So depending on the level of severity of the issues, some of them can be addressed through changing self-care and coping strategies. The next step would be to check in with a primary care doctor if that doesn't work. And then therapy or medication can be helpful. Just to reiterate, if your child is self-harming or suicidal, that's one of those situations where you kind of skip past those first two and go straight to accessing mental health resources. So these are some brief self-care strategies. We've already talked about things like sleep, exercise, and eating healthy, but there are some other things you can do, like having a positive attitude, creating an organized space, doing less, saying no, cut back on things you don't need to do, take breaks, and preparing the night before. This is something that we as adults can probably put into practice too. I know I feel a lot better and the morning goes a lot better if I decide what I'm going to wear the night before. And I can still change my mind because I think we all have those days where we put on our outfit and you're like, no, it's not working. But when we prepare the night before, it then gives us time the next morning if something does happen. Like if the dog decides this is going to be the day he's going to throw up on the carpet in the morning and you've got to clean it up, you're now not behind, you've kind of prepared. But then we also want to insert coping strategies, things that can help us manage the stressors that arise in our life. So these can be addressing the stressor directly through problem-focused coping, or through emotion. So I've got an example of a problem-focused solution there. Most of us are more familiar with coping from an emotion-focused way, where we experience a stressful day, we deal something to deal with the emotion. So I know myself, I'm probably going to do some TV watching when I get home. It'll be too late for me to walk the dog, so I won't get to do that. Maybe I'll take a hot shower, read a little book, and kind of cozy into bed. We all know what's going to work best for us. These are some specific healthy alternatives for your kids, for them, that they can use if they're experiencing a big emotion that's making them uncomfortable. So if they're feeling empty, they can bite a hot pepper or eat some ginger. Ginger is really spicy. Taking a cold shower. If they're feeling sad or depressed, they can play with a pet or listening to soothing music. If they're feeling angry, taking out their anger in healthy ways. Because remember, there's nothing wrong with anger. It's all in how we process that anger. This next slide I won't really talk about because it's just links to some meditations that you can use, but you'll have the slides so you can click on these links. And these are some helpful mental health apps. Same thing when I send out the slides, you'll be able to click them and it'll take it for iPhone. You'll actually want to look them up if you have an Android. Some other helpful videos and websites, we've got yoga for gratitude, music for relaxation, the Reddit self-help thread, how to journal and journaling prompts. All of those can be helpful ways for coping. And again, it's not just about what our kids do, it's what we do and put into practice and show by example. So the next step if coping and self-care don't work is we want to talk to a doctor. That can be a pediatrician, your family doctor. You want to take your child in. And the reason why is because it's easier to rule out physical causes. Those physical causes are going to generally be easier to treat, especially in that young adulthood range. We have, especially with young women, they're more likely to have thyroid disorders or anemia or other hormonal problems that can look like depression, but are easier to treat. Also, sometimes doctors are a good first step because a lot more practices now are having, they have therapists in office. So you can talk to your doctor about your concern and they can make you an appointment, or you can walk down the hall right then and there and talk to someone who is trained in mental health. But also, primary care doctors, pediatricians can prescribe psych meds without necessarily having to talk to a therapist. I don't recommend just doing medication, but sometimes medication, while you're waiting to get them in with a therapist, can address some of those immediate pressing emotions that are causing distress. There are a few different types of mental health treatment that I am not going to go in depth with, but the one I want to point out is called outpatient. Outpatient therapy is what you typically think of when you think of therapy sessions. You go and you sit in a room and you talk to someone. They're supposed to be at least 45 minutes long, and there are definitely safety concerns with parents and therapists. Even if you are legally allowed to ask for your child's records, which in the state of Tennessee, it's not against the health laws. Under the age of 16, you can get their records. It's something I wouldn't encourage because it just breaks any trust. Your child deserves to have their own private space. But if you have concerns, a good therapist will take time to know you and will be available for any one-on-one questions if you have them. I personally, especially with younger kids, I'm more likely to recommend family therapy, so you can improve the family dynamic and also address the mental health needs of the child specifically. There are a few different types of mental health professionals that you'll see when you're doing research on care. No one type is better than the other. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the first 6, the first 6 minus psychiatrists do therapy. Psychiatrists are primarily for medication. Personally, I don't recommend using a psychiatrist as your primary therapist, but they can be really helpful for someone that has complex medical needs for their medication. And when you're doing research, I personally recommend someone who is licensed. So always look for someone who is licensed. So that's going to be your doctors, folks who have their doctorate, and folks that have an L at the beginning of their name that stands for licensed. So in a perfect world, let's say you've come to a conclusion, my child needs mental health care. I don't recommend you forcing them to get care against their wishes. But as their parent, at least in Tennessee, under the age of 16, you can. But it's a lot better if they're going into it willingly. But help them feel in control of the process. So doing research, if you have private insurance, either through the marketplace or through an employer, you have more choice as to who you pick for your therapist. If you've got TennCare or Safety Net, you only have a few options. But if you have the ability to do research, figure out who's going to be the best fit for them and make sure they feel comfortable with someone. So involve the child in the process. Don't break that confidentiality, even if you legally have the right to. Get to know your child's therapist. Make the decision on medication, what's going to work best for you. And if you see anything happening, if your child sees anything happening that is inappropriate in those sessions, make sure to advocate. You're not going to hurt your therapist's feelings if it's not a good fit and you want to see someone else. But remember to consult your child in that process. Use all the resources you have. Mental health recovery is not one and done. It's an ongoing process. It's something I am in front of you today. I continue working on it every single day and using all the tools I can to improve my mental health. Let's say you're at this training today and your child has historically struggled with their mental health. First and foremost, I think accept that your child isn't perfect. No one's child is perfect. For certain mental health conditions, you will need to be more patient and flexible. With time and consistent effort, things will get better. Make sure your expectations are clear and concise, and don't get upset if they're not consistently met. Praise your child and recognize their strengths, even when they're struggling, and use positive reinforcement. Mental health is an explanation, not an excuse for bad behavior. Children still need to learn the appropriate ways to behave. Discipline is different than punishment. When your child misbehaves, explain what they did wrong, redirect to a different behavior. When you see them making positive choices, reward those positive choices. When they continue to make poor choices, step in with negative consequences. You also want to model those good behaviors in yourself. You can't take the perspective as do as I say, not as I do. It needs to be do as I say and do as I do, and they need to match. And make sure to take care of yourself. If you're on this call and you're a caregiver of someone who struggled with their mental health, you have likely struggled with your mental health. So you could even benefit from getting therapy and taking care of your own needs. Here's my information if you want to get in touch, and some great resources. My particular favorite in this list of websites is the Child Mind Institute. Fantastic. They have some great articles on addressing specific mental health needs. These are a couple outpatient treatment resources in Knox County. We've got McNabb and Cherokee. Those are going to be your TennCare resources if you've got TennCare. And then I know I'm running a little over on time, but I want to briefly talk about crisis resources. So let's say your child is suicidal. Let's say they're saying they're going to hurt someone else. Let's say they're using drugs and they're overdosing. These are sort of your steps. So generally, your first step is going to be to call mobile crisis. There are certain things mobile crisis won't assess. They won't deal with if someone is overdosing or if someone is at threat to harm others, because they don't want to put themselves in that line of fire. I mean, can you blame them? So they'll generally recommend that you call 911 at that point. So 911 is when you immediate medical intervention is needed or there are safety concerns. You can also sometimes call mobile crisis, and instead of dealing with police, you can go straight to like a dispatch or a hospital, so that police aren't involved. If you do end up calling 911 in Knoxville, we have a co-responder team, meaning there's a mental health professional and a police officer that respond. See if you can get them to come out if there's mental health concerns, or see if they're called CIT, trained officers, that can respond that have more experience with mental health. And the reason I add these caveats is because unfortunately, folks with mental health issues are 17% more likely to die in police confrontations. So be very explicit when you are calling 911 with the fact there is a mental health issue so that they can come in being fully prepared. Non-emergency number, that's the one for Knox County. That's helpful if you need to do what's called a safety check. Let's say you haven't heard from someone in a couple days, you want someone to swing by their house to make sure they're okay. That's the number you would call. Then we have the statewide crisis line, and 988 is something that rolled out just in July, and it's been fantastic. It's a shift of the suicide prevention lifeline. Most of the calls now are answered in state, so they'll be aware of other resources, but just be aware that it could be answered by someone out of state. I would love for everyone on the training today, if you could pull out your phone, scan this QR code. I am so sorry I don't have the link handy for me to post in the chat. I can send it out in the email. I'd love for you to give me feedback for today, and I will leave this up and we can officially end the training. So if you need to head out, feel free to go ahead. Or what I am going to plan on doing is officially stopping the recording, and I'll turn off the mute feature. So if you have any questions you want to ask out loud, you can, or you can go ahead and put them in the chat. And thank you for everyone who's heading out. Thank you for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And again, I'll stick around for questions.